was in Philadelphia on Monday. As the Democratic Convention opened up, we marched on Biden's headquarters with the Poor People's Army. And it was quite an event. When we got there, they had put up overnight a rent-a-fence, literally said rent-a-fence on it. And it was in an office building surrounded by all the big corporate buildings right around City Hall in Philadelphia, which is a big, ornate government building. So the corporations could keep an eye on the government they had bought. And we had a lot of spirited speeches. This was organized by the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. One of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign you hear a lot about on the media, the female reverend, whose name I forget right now, she learned about this stuff as an intern for Howie Angela, our former vice presidential candidate, who is the moving spirit behind the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. So we're talking particularly about housing. Earlier in the day, they took me on a poverty tour, and we went into a takeover house where a woman with 5 children who had been in a home that burned down, the movement got her into a house. There are 10 apartments in Philadelphia for every homeless person on the street. But given the way our real estate industry works, the homeless don't get housed. So that was a big theme. We talked about a guaranteed minimum income above poverty, a central demand of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, a job guarantee, Medicare for all. We had women whose children had been killed by gun violence speaking out, in this case against the police not solving the problem, not finding out who did those murders. And, people get harassed by the police, but they can't solve basic problems and basic crimes. So these are some of the issues that were discussed at the rally before and after. And it was a very spirited thing. Of course, the corporate media didn't cover it. The ABC affiliate was there, but they were looking for poor people to talk to. They didn't want to talk to the only presidential candidate that showed up, even though Biden and Trump were invited. Of course, the last thing they want to do is be marching with a bunch of poor people. So that's, I'm on the road now. I'll be down in South Carolina with Angela on Friday. We're going to Alabama to support some local Green candidates in Pritchard, Alabama. And then I'm heading back up to South Carolina. I'm not sure where I go from there, but we're still in the middle of petition drives. Being on the road, I'm not exactly up to date, but I know we filed in Iowa. I think they certified us. We filed in Minneapolis. I think about 3 times the number of signatures we need to get. I hope to be petitioning in Virginia. Their deadline is on Friday. Hopefully I can help them. And Angela, I've been talking enough. Why don't you take it from there? You may know more about where we are in the petition drives than I do at this point.
I was just also thinking about how, and I want to lift up the action in Philadelphia this weekend. I was not able to be there for the march yesterday, but I was able to be there on Sunday, and Howie and I helped facilitate some breakout sessions and have some really, really amazing discussions with some amazing people. So I want to, lift up Howie Angela yet again, because she is just that amazing a person. And yes, we turned in today just under 5,000 petitions in Minnesota. The minimum is 2,000. So, they always eliminate some. And so we have, with 5,000, we've got a very comfortable margin. So big up Minnesota, big up to the folks that put the work in on that. Big up to our folks that are on the ground putting in that work. Tennessee is going to be turning in on Thursday. Iowa is certified, and we are on the ballot. And so we want to lift up and thank all of the people, during this plague, who are literally putting their lives on the line and shouldn't have to, are putting in the work to make this happen.
So that is my press secretary photobombing me in the back. Wave at him, Kevin. That's Kevin Zeese. And I'm staying with him and Margaret Flowers, and we're going up to Bethesda tomorrow to be at a demonstration where they are desecrating an African-American cemetery. That you want to speak more to that, Angela, because you've got a statement out on that.
Yes, we actually have been following this issue, something that Kevin Zeese and Margaret brought to us about the fact that there is a cemetery, an African-American cemetery in Bethesda, Maryland, that is being desecrated. And, they want to build a parking lot in that space for people who live in an apartment complex, if I'm correct there. So just the fact of the disrespect of African American and African burial places, and the fact that African, Black life in this country, whether we are alive or whether we are not alive, the disrespect of Black life in this country never stops. And we're seeing it here with, there's obvious, folks have shown up and fought and are fighting, very actively fighting the desecration, the dump trucks, which makes me feel sad because I'm a dump truck driver, but that they're carrying away relics, that these are people's bodies. And it's very painful. And if anyone is like aware of a lot of African and African American traditions around death and around loss in that way, these are special sites to us. They're very sacred sites, and there are certain things that you do not do to sacred sites, and to for the state and the city to basically say that this is something trivial, something that they don't have to be concerned about, is just an extension of the disrespect that Black life endures from the state in this country, and it is very, very painful to watch.
Yeah, I think it's an expression of how immoral the real estate industry is. We know about how they've segregated us. We know how the developers, the landlords, and the real estate agents and the bankers behind them and the lawyers that grease the wheels all make money on segregation, like blockbusting. You're scared of white people with Black people, they sell low, and then the real estate agent sells high to the Black people moving in, and then the white people move out in the suburbs, buy high to get one of those McMansions. And then going the other way, you have gentrification, where the landlord jacks up the rent to push out the poor people, often people of color, in order to bring in a wealthier clientele. And the real estate industry, the private housing markets, have never been able to provide affordable housing for everybody that needs it. This is a sector where you got to have a big public sector. Like in Europe, 20 or 30% of the housing is what they call social housing, either public or cooperative housing. In the city of Vienna, it's over 60%. And because they have this big public sector, the private rents can't get jacked up because they got to compete with the public rents, which are operating at cost. So people get housed there. Here in Philadelphia, I think I mentioned this, for every apartment that's available, there are 10 apartments available for every person who's homeless. Housing market is not about housing low-income people. So one thing that Angela and I have in the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal is a public housing program to provide affordable housing to everybody within a decade. We have nearly 10 million people that cannot afford to find affordable housing at their income level, which is defined by the federal government of 30% of income. A quarter of the people in this country pay over half their income for housing, and half the people don't meet that affordability standard. But there are 10 million very low income people that just can't get housing, and that's why homelessness is so high. So we're talking about 25 million units, a $2.5 trillion 10-year program of public housing. And people say, and compare that to the Sanders AOC Green New Deal public housing program, theirs was 10% of what we're talking about. And I don't understand why they went so small, because to meet the need, you gotta build 25 million units. In fact, when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, the third big civil rights law, there was companion legislation to build 25 million units of affordable housing. The problem was they gave up on public housing, and they planned to do what they call public-private partnerships, which means the public pays subsidies to the private developers. Now, it was supposed to be also to desegregate housing. So Nixon blew that up. It passed under the end of the Johnson administration, and it got blown up under Nixon. But they were at least looking at the right scale. I mean, why even bother if you're not going to try to challenge the problem? So the 25 million units, we would reserve 40% for low-income people so they have access, and then we'd let anybody live in there. Professionals, middle-income working people, like they do in Europe, because the public housing we were building between World War II and 1970, when they pretty much stopped building public housing units, was increased segregation. It put poor people of color in the worst neighborhood, isolated from jobs, transportation, healthcare, and food. Nowadays, we got food deserts. And that's not the way to do it. A good public housing program can help us desegregate by race and class. It can be clean energy with heat pumps and induction stoves, so we don't have to burn natural gas. So it's an energy program. It's a jobs program, obviously. It's a desegregation program as well as an affordable housing program. Think of the coalition we can build around that. So that is in contrast to the real estate industry. So what they're doing in this cemetery is they're burying the artifacts of history. It's not only the African Americans who are buried there, it's what they was done to them. That was a tobacco plantation. Later it was a plantation for breeding slaves, basically by rape. And they just want to pave this over and make it go away. But the demonstration tomorrow's protesting that. We're not going to let it go away. That's what we're talking about tomorrow. And so we expected an expert on this issue to show up, but I'm not sure why that person is not here. But in the meantime, maybe we could take some of the questions. Here we go.
Burnout collectivist. And let me just do a shout out real quick. Hey, Maritha Davis. She's new to the Greens, and I'm like really excited. So question for Howie/Angela. What's your response to the rumors in the media that Biden might not even push for a public option after being elected?
Well, I'll start with that. This is what happens when the left surrenders and settles for somebody who's been a balanced budget conservative and a corporate neoliberal his whole political career. And I hate to say it because I kind of like Bernie Sanders, but he compromised on Medicare for all. He said he would accept Medicare for all, 55 and up, and for children, and in between it would be, the Obamacare with a public option to buy into Medicare. For Bernie Sanders, that's a huge compromise. So he did that before their, joint committees with Sanders and Biden people. And when they came out the other end, it wasn't Medicare for all. It wasn't even what Sanders' compromise was. So Sanders gave ground, and so Biden's thinking, I got these progressives in my hip pocket. I hadn't heard about this rumor, but if that's true, it just shows if we don't stand for what we want and vote for what we want, we sure enough not going to get it. And the way to have some leverage is to support what you want and make the politicians come to you. But if we vote for Biden, as I like to say, you get lost in the sauce. If you're for Medicare for all, nobody knows that. You voted for Biden. You vote for the green ticket, everybody knows we're for Medicare for all. So that's my response, Angela.
And just this idea, if I'm remembering the question correctly, of pushing him leftward. If they're not offering, if the things that you're asking for are not on the table to begin with, where is our, if you support these folks, where is your leverage to make them, once you give them what they want, they've been elected, where is your leverage to make them support the policies that you want, even though they're not supporting them going into the election? And that's just my question. It's like, if it's not there, they have had it, they have pulled it off the table, they're not willing to discuss it at this point. Where do you think the leverage is going to come from to push these folks the way you want them to go when they're not even talking about these issues?
Andy Messick, have we heard anything about Maryland? The answer is yes. They certified us, correct?
Yes, Maryland was certified today too.
All right. I didn't even know that, and I'm in Maryland. It's pretty busy. Can't keep up on everything right now.
Mike Tuller. Hey, Mike. I hate my state sometimes. Quote, we had until August 4th, 2020 to collect 2,000 valid signatures in Wisconsin. We turned in the maximum allowed, 4,000, but the Democrats still challenged our petition. That means we have to fight to get on the ballot even though we collected twice the signatures required. Is this resolved yet? And as somebody who is severely angry with Wisconsin on at least 30 different levels, I'm going to punt that to you, Howie.
Yeah, she's a native of Wisconsin. I wouldn't hate the whole state. It's the Democratic Party that did this. And you know what the challenge is? Angela Walker moved within the city of Florence, South Carolina during the petitioning period. And when she changed her address, we notified the Elections Commission in Wisconsin and asked them, how do we handle this? We followed their instructions. And the Democrats, their lawyers going around telling the media that we couldn't follow instructions, which is a lie. And if they knock us off the ballot for this, God help our democracy, because we know what the Republicans are doing. They're suppressing the vote, but party suppression is part of voter suppression. We know that 61% of Jill Stein's voters in 2016, according to the CBS exit poll, wouldn't have voted if she wasn't on the ballot. Now, Michigan and Wisconsin were pretty close in that race, but you subtract 61% of Stein voters, and the percentage going for Clinton of the whole Stein voters was about 25%. So it actually wouldn't have made any difference if Stein was not in the race in terms of Clinton winning those states. But the difference would be that Green voters would not have voted. So when they try to knock the Greens off the ballot, they're suppressing the vote. The Democrats are doing that too. It's not just the Republicans. And people got to understand that. Party suppression is part of voter suppression. And the Democrats are not too smart about this. It's not only Republicans that can be dummies like Donald Trump. Because we have there are only 6 Senate candidates the Green Party's running for the U.S. Senate. None of them that I'm aware of are in a close race. And not all of them may get on the ballot because of this kind of ballot challenges we're getting from the Democratic Party. It's not just Wisconsin. But in other races, down ballot, Green voters are likely to choose the Democrat over the Republican. When Ralph Nader ran in 2000, Debbie Stabenow in Michigan and Maria Cantwell in Washington in close races probably won because Nader voters went down the ballot and voted for them. And that flipped the Senate that year. The Democrats want to flip the Senate. And they're actually losing voters, our voters, who are likely to vote for their Senate candidates if we're on the ballot. But if we're not on the ballot, our people stay home. And the Democrats lose those votes. So the Democrats not only mean, nasty, immoral by knocking us off the ballot, they're stupid.
And I think, just to interject with that, at one time I was the legislative director for my union. And Democratic candidates, primarily Democratic candidates, who wanted union support or my union support, they had to come through me. So I am personally wondering how many people who had a hand in this effort at party suppression, how many of them know me personally? And I really honestly can't tell you how that makes me feel. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that alone.
Joseph Fire.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Fire won. How do you guys get into the debate? You want to start on that one, Angela?
We got to fight for it. Right now, from what I've been seeing on social media, there's a petition going around that folks have been signing and have been boosting up. Let Howie debate is a hashtag. I think that a lot of people going into this don't realize the sheer amount of going uphill that we have to face as a third party simply to get what the two major parties take for granted as far as media access, as far as the access to the debates, as far as being seen and being heard. There really is a concerted effort to make sure that third, fourth, fifth, whatever parties are not able to get the attention that we need. And it really is an uphill battle. And so the League of Women Voters used to be the people who were in charge of the presidential debates, and that is not the case anymore. The entity that is overseeing those debates is in bed with both those parties. And so, this is an uphill battle for us, and how you can elaborate on that as you do.
Yeah, that Commission on Presidential Debates sounds like a government commission. In fact, it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Democratic and Republican parties. They're sponsoring the debate. The corporate state media stenographers of the two-party corporate state are going along with that. That's why they set up the Commission on Presidential Debate after they muscled aside the League of Women Voters back in the late 1980s. We're not getting in that debate. We've sued over the years, but the courts have basically said it's a private corporation. We can't do anything about it. The FEC has no jurisdiction. And so I think what the fight we need to get into the debate is to get into the media so people can hear our side of the story. And maybe we can start a debate about things that are not being discussed, like this new nuclear arms race that should be a top campaign issue, but because both capitalist parties support the nuclear modernization program the U.S. initiated and destabilized the world and launched this nuclear arms race, is not being discussed. We're the only ones discussing it. So I would say to people concerned about this, write to your media outlets and say, how come we don't hear about Howie Hawkins? How come we don't hear about Angela Walker? MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, the LA Times, you name it. But not even the progressive media, so-called, is covering us. Democracy Now!, The Nation, In These Times, and so forth. So you have plenty of options to send your, requests and, make them serious letters. Say it like you mean it, but don't be disrespectful. Be polite, but firm. The Green Party deserves to be heard because Biden and Trump don't have solutions to the life or death issues we're facing. So please write to the media. And the more people do that, the more the media may say, hey, there's maybe a story here we're missing, because their bottom line interest is to get more people to read what they're talking about. And if they think people are interested, we'll get some coverage.
JS236, hey, as Commander-in-Chief, what would be your criteria for military intervention? It's a good question.
Yeah, well, if our intervention is requested by a legitimate government, we would consider that. If there is a multilateral agreement through the UN Security Council, we should consider that. But what we shouldn't be doing is just deciding we don't like who's running a government and we're going to put somebody new in there, like deciding we're going to invade Venezuela. They were threatening to do, and then we've actually sponsored some mercenary actions and put Juan Guaido in place of Nicolas Maduro. It's none of our business. And you can criticize Maduro from his left, but that doesn't mean I should say who should run Venezuela. And the U.S. government certainly. I heard today that Biden said we need to replace Erdogan of Turkey. No, the Turkish people need to do that. I mean, it's their government, and a lot of them want to. But for us to intervene militarily or in other ways is against the principle of self-determination, which is one of the founding principles of this country. So, when there is good reason to intervene because the country asks us to help them, defend them against an aggressor, or the world community wants to stop genocide somewhere or aggression by a country, and there's a consensus on that, yeah, we can participate in that. But that's about it.
Ooh, that's a good one. Drew Murray, I know you just went, but I like this. Do you believe that climate crisis is an LGBTQ plus issue? Yes, indeed. I think that it's an issue, and this is going to sound, like, but I think that people in marginalized communities are particularly harmed by climate change. And that is true of us across the LGBTQ plus rainbow. A lot of us intersect with, communities that are marginalized in other ways. And we are often in areas that are impacted by environmental racism. We are all, dealing with, lack of job access, lack of resources. All of these things are affected by climate change. And so I think that, and I also think that some of the people who are the most vocal about ecological issues are people in our community, as LGBTQ plus people. And so I think that climate change is something that we are in marginalized communities particularly sensitive to the fallout of. And I think it's something that we pay attention to because of that. And Howie, what are your thoughts?
Well, we talk about intersectionality, but we don't often make the connection between the environmental crisis, particularly the climate crisis, the domination and oppression of different groups of people in society. Because the same ideas and attitudes and institutions that justify the oppression and exploitation of one group of human beings by another are the same ideas, attitudes, and institutions that are extended out into nature and justify the attempt to dominate nature. You can't really, and exploit it. And if we're going to reharmonize humanity with nature, we got to reharmonize human with human. And that includes the full freedom and equality for LGBTQ people. So that's the way I see the connection. If you don't fight oppression among the people, you're not going to stop the exploitation of nature and the destruction of the environment.
Capitalism must die, period.
But that's the dominant institution right now that justifies exploitation of people, their labor, and exploitation of nature with no regard for the future, because profit is the only thing that the capitalists are concerned about. Kristen, who may be my cousin, because my mother was an Olsen with the O.
Right?
A voter who signed my ballot access petition asked me, what would be your first action as POTUS? Top immediate priority. Well, let's talk about the first day, because I don't like to counterpose things. We would declare a climate emergency in order to get the federal government, every agency on the same page, and do what we can there before we get legislation passed. We would pardon whistleblowers and political prisoners on day one, like Mumia, like Leonard Peltier, like Edward Snowden, and drop the charges. Edward Snowden doesn't need to be pardoned because he hasn't been convicted. The charges against him need to be dropped. The charges against Julian Assange need to be dropped. That can be done the first day. I think we'd set a new tone. We got a president right now that lives by denigrating people and trying to divide us. And we need a new tone from the top says it's not what we're about. So I think a statement like that. And we just it's not even lunchtime yet. But Angela, you want to add?
I was typing in the chat. Where were you with that? Oh, about our first actions, like top priorities. Did you say closing the camps?
No, but that definitely.
Killing ICE. Well, not killing ICE. Disbanding ICE immediately. Cease and desist. Closing the camps because and yes, freeing political prisoners. Yes, yes, immediately.
Yeah, not just close the camps, but let the people camped out on the Mexican side of the border in as they have a legal right to be. And then provide support for these families so that they can find housing and health care and social services. These camps are now COVID epidemic centers. And it's, I think, a crime against humanity. I think there probably charges can be brought against Trump and the people who were good, as they used to say, good Germans carrying out these horrific orders. That's where you get at ICE and Border Patrol, who have a particularly Border Patrol, we know from that Facebook page. Half the Border Patrol members were on this page was full of racism and misogyny. So these have to be dismantled. And, if there are good officers in those forces, they can reapply, but they got to be vetted. And then, of course, we want to open the borders. The right of human travel, human movement is a basic fundamental human right. They put it in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at that time with respect to countries that had internal passports, but in a globalized economy, the borders between countries are like internal passports. And they're used to divide workers from each other, to keep some countries' workers particularly oppressed, so they are used against workers in our country, saying if you don't accept concessions and lower wages, we're going to Mexico or China or Malaysia or Vietnam or one of these other low-wage labor markets. And we have open borders within the European Union. There's a group of Andean nations in South America. There's the 4 in Central America. Open borders. There are open border agreements in Africa. And we made a big deal out of the borders, like, Trump says they're invading us before the 2018 election. I mean, come on, this guy, he's childlike. He lives in a make-believe world. He just makes it up and thinks like if he wishes hard enough, it'll become true. But of course it doesn't, and we're the victims of that kind of thinking. So yeah, the immigration, that definitely on the first day, the order goes out, these people are to be freed, and they go through the process we got now until we can get that open borders policy. But we want a legal status for every immigrant so they can access social services. Just think about it from a public health point of view without even worrying about whether you care about the immigrants or not. If they don't have access to health care and testing and contact tracing and other things, and they're hiding from the government because they don't have documents, that's a public health problem. I mean, our policy is so irrational. It's like punishing people for the sake of punishing them, even though it punishes us too. We have had crops rot in the field because immigrant labor won't come in and do it. There was a period back, maybe 15 years ago when the Border Patrol in upstate New York started going after black people, and especially Jamaicans, because they would come up and pick the apples as seasonal workers. Jamaicans said, to hell with this, we don't need this. They stayed home, the apples rotted in the field.
When I was a Greyhound driver, I used to drive them up there. They got charters. And just to jump in, I saw your question, Green Lehigh, about, being somebody of limited, we're not rich. And so wanting to be climate friendly and not being able to afford it. And I saw that and I was like, no, you start with what you have where you are. and it's making small decisions. You know, if you are able to recycle, you recycle. If you are able to buy things that are eco-friendly or make them, because, you know, I do make soap. So, you know, things like that. It doesn't have to be a thing where like you have to spend money to do things that are eco-friendly. A lot of things like, you know, what you clean with, you can make yourself and you're probably already doing that. So I just wanted to reassure you, because I saw that and I was like, no, as somebody who lives check to check myself, yes, you know, vinegar, baking soda, essential oils, they're your friends. Clean, you know, it's starting small where you are with what you have, and it does not take a lot of money.
NetLad P, do you feel that past presidents have wasted time and resources playing ping pong with laws? For example, abortion and protecting the environment. How do you prevent a future president from rolling over your law? And we can't reach into the future, but I think what we're talking about when we talk about eco-socialism is a socialist economic democracy, which is really essential. You know, Bernie Sanders, he called himself a democratic socialist, but all he wanted to do was tax the super rich to fund social programs. The problem was it kept the super rich with concentrated economic power, which translates into concentrated political power. And they can roll back and resist these social programs. If we change the structure of power by changing an economic system, I mean, capitalism is a system of private corporate tyrannies. You know, within the corporation, it's very top down. There's no democracy. Even some of your basic constitutional rights you can't exercise in that corporation. If we have a socialist economic democracy, then we change where the power is. And then I think you'll have less ping-ponging back and forth between a conservative and a sort of liberal administration of capitalism. You will have a new power structure. You'll have a system where socialism is the dominant mode of production. And the power will be very different. It'll be much more egalitarian, not just in terms of economic outcomes, but in terms of political power. And I believe people are not going to vote and support policies that will put other people in charge of their lives like we are under capitalism. So I think that's the way we avoid going back and forth on these different laws. We got to change the system and make it truly democratic. The big problem in our capitalist so-called democracy is that public policy public opinion doesn't translate into public policy. You may recall they called it the oligarchy study. It came out about 2015, 2016, and they looked at the two political scientists, they looked at 1,800 issues before Congress and what the median income voter wanted, the average person, and the top 10%, the upper middle class and upper class. And every time there was a conflict, the upper middle, upper class, the elite got what they wanted. The people didn't. And that's the way our politics works. And until we change away from, capitalist tyranny toward socialist economic democracy, we're going to go back and forth between liberal and conservative versions of capitalism, but not secure some of these basic rights that we ought to have.
James Sims, 4. How does the Green Party plan to help out farmers in the South and the Rust Belt?
Hey, you're looking at me for that one. Okay, that's part of our eco-socialist Green New Deal. We have a whole section on agriculture. We want to help farmers and ranchers go organic, provide them with the money they need to make that transition as we get off of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. We want to set up a system of parity pricing for all commodities, not just the ones that now get subsidies like corn and soybeans and cotton, but also all the fruits and vegetables and dairy products. And parity pricing just means the floor price goes up with the cost of production. And that way farmers will be guaranteed a return on the money they put in. They cover the cost of their production. We also want to have supply management so we don't have gluts in some markets and shortages in others. And then, a lot of technical assistance as we go organic. And also, in order to do that, we got to get absentee ownership. All these, a lot of the farmland is now owned by Wall Street investors through hedge funds and private equity. And most farmers are becoming tenant farmers, just on a larger scale than the old little tenant farmers, back in the day, particularly in the South, where people were sharecroppers. Now they're, these big industrial farms, but farmers less and less own them. So we got to end absentee ownership, corporate ownership, and also the corporations that supply inputs to agriculture are very monopolized. So they screw the farmer and the consumer. the Monsantos of the world, the Cargills of the world. So we need to promote cooperatives in that field, or even public enterprises that operate at cost for the benefit of the farmer and the consumer rather than for private profit. There's a lot of reform needs to be done there. And if we're going to go organic, we need about 1 million more farmers on the land because it's a bit more labor intensive. And we got the new farmers here. They're the immigrants from Mexico and Central America who were farmers and whose American dream is to become a farmer here instead of milking cows and picking crops. Those are some of the things we want to do. And then we want to put in these Green New Deal factories. We got a whole manufacturing program, but put them in the small and medium-sized rural towns and cities so that there are manufacturing jobs processing the agricultural products so that manufacturing spread across the country in every sector of the economy, rural and urban, is diversified and therefore more stable. So those are some of the elements of what we want to do with agriculture, and its complement manufacturing that deals with agricultural inputs. I'm not just talking about food. I'm talking about like hemp. We can do industrial hemp finally again, and that creates great cloth, paper products, food in the form of hemp seeds and hemp oil. It's an incredible plant, but it needs to be processed when you harvest it. So these are the kinds of things we can put in the towns in rural America and bring back manufacturing jobs to rural America as well.
Rad Brobley, what do you say to people, I'm thinking that's what that is, who are worried about being vote shamed come November? Well, my short answer is stand on what you believe. And as far as vote shaming, come November, honey, they're already doing it. So, and this is a question we get all the time from people who are having to essentially defend their decision to vote third party in an election that people feel is really, 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 and for good reasons, really, 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 a life or more suffering. Just telling people, why you're voting the way that you vote. And people are going to come at you with a lot of, they're projecting their fears and things like that on you. I've had people say that to vote third party is a privilege and all of this other stuff. And it's just like you have to be able to stand on what you believe in. And Howie, because I'm like talking myself in circles, but y'all know what I mean. But yeah.
Well, I think you have to be privileged to think that a government under Biden is going to improve your lot in life. If you're privileged, you're going to be all right. But if you're struggling, Biden has no answers for you. So, that's number one. And as far as vote shaming goes, I say vote shame them back. Don't vote for a hawk that's going to get us in more wars, for somebody that wants to subsidize private health insurance instead of have a public system of Medicare for all. Don't vote for somebody. Shame on you for voting for somebody that doesn't have a climate policy. Wants to frack the hell out of the country, build more pipelines and gas-fired power plants, and makes an empty promise to add a whole infrastructure, massive infrastructure for carbon capture and sequestration, which is uneconomical and will not be done because the oil and gas industry to which Biden is pandering will not do it. He's pro-nuclear. Nuclear costs 2 or 3 times more than solar or wind over the life cycle of those facilities, or generation facilities. And that's what Joe Biden's for, because the nuclear industry is for Joe Biden. See, that's the game. So shame on you for giving your vote to such a bad policy. Now, is Trump versus him? Yeah, but there's 2 ways of voting against Trump. You can vote Biden or you can vote Green. That's a vote against Trump, and shame on you for settling for Biden. Vote for what you want if you want Medicare for all and a real Green New Deal and student medical debt relief and a job guarantee and all the other things we're standing for. Shame on you if you say, yeah, that's fine, but I'm going to vote for Biden, who's opposed to all those things. Shame on you.
Well said, Howard. And hey, Tiffany. And before I take it, Tiffany's question, Brian Egon is asking about he says, I've tried looking it up, but I can't find anything on your service in the Army. I was hoping I could ask you about what you did during your time in the Army. I am pleased to admit I was the worst Army reservist to ever do it. I was a what was it back then? It was 76 Yankee, unit supply specialist, which means I would have run the PX / the armory. that is what I would have done. Yeah, you're not gonna find anything on it. It was one of them in and out kind of things. But yes, I wore the uniform. I did what I was asked to do as a reservist, and that was pretty much that. Tiffany Medusa, my homie, what is your plan for restructuring the educational system?
Okay, it looks like you want me to start. First of all, we got to, at the federal level, stop pushing charter schools, high-stakes testing, the whole privatization agenda, which is designed to destroy public education. We saw it big time under George Bush, bigger time under Barack Obama and Arne Duncan, and biggest time under this crazy woman, Secretary DeVos, who just is off the charts bad in that regard. We need to have equitable funding of public schools, which are now dependent on unequally distributed property taxes at the local level. We should federalize funding, fund the public schools out of federal progressive income and wealth taxes, and make sure every student gets a minimum per capita allocation, and then have additional allocations where there are special needs or special assistance, where you can provide wraparound services in community schools to mostly racially oppressed communities that have been, discriminated, segregated, and exploited for generations. We need to condition that federal aid on a minimum salary for teachers. Bernie Sanders suggested $60,000 a year. I think that's a good starting income for a teacher. We need to value our teachers instead of treat them like, low-wage workers and try to get them on the cheap. No other country does that. It's unbelievable that how little we pay our teachers. And, you find out they're on food stamps, taking second jobs, and they're still reaching in their pocket to put things in their classroom that the school system doesn't provide. So, we need a good educational system. People say, well, education is expensive. Well, what's more expensive is ignorance and people not being able to navigate a modern society and getting in trouble and doing things they shouldn't do to try to get over. So I think we need to adequately fund schools, equitably fund schools. We also need to desegregate the schools. We're as desegregated or more so than we were when Brown v. Board of Education passed, because this goes back to the real estate industry we're talking about at the top. We are more residentially segregated by race and class, and particularly class, which overlaps with race, than we were when Brown v. Board of Education passed. And we made some progress until about 1980. We've been going backwards since then. So I think we need to look at federal legislation that can begin to change the school district lines, which are like the new Jim Crow lines. And they're not enforced by faucets that say white here, colored here, but de facto, if you're on one side in one district, you might be underfunded, the next district is well-funded, and those lines are policed by the police we got. That's why they harass low-income neighborhoods and don't solve the serious crimes there and keep people down, particularly black people, and out of the upscale communities. And those communities are defined often by school district lines, municipal lines, or just neighborhood lines that don't have lines, but the police know what they are. And so there's a lot there, but those are some of the things we need. And we need to make higher education at public colleges and trade schools and continuing adult education free, like it was, say, at City College in New York from 1848 till 1976. Why the hell did we go backwards on that? Also for pre-kindergarten and childcare. I mean, we got a childcare crisis right now because the schools are not opening up or opening up intermittently, and because of the COVID. And then parents want to go to work, but what do they do with their kids? Childcare is too expensive. And so we got a childcare crisis. And, the kids are being doubled up in, friends and, relatives' homes, but it's not good care, particularly among, in situations where people are stretched for resources. So that's part of education as well. Gabe Coda, you've been pushing for ranked choice voting. What are your thoughts on proportional representation? Are they the same concept? If not, can they be used at the same time? And I'll start on that. You can use ranked choice voting for proportional representation in legislative bodies. You have multi-member districts, you rank your choices, and the votes are allocated by what they call the single transferable vote, which basically means if your first choice isn't elected, it goes to your next choice. Your vote does. And it continues in that process, just like it does in a single seat race for an executive office. So I think when we talk about proportional representation, we should always add, when we talk about ranked choice voting, we should also add that we're just not talking about, mayor, governor, and we're not talking about single member districts for legislative bodies. There we want multi-member districts. So ranked choice voting leads to proportional representation. You know, why should I ran a race, I got 48% running against an incumbent, well, no, it was an open seat against a Democrat in a district that's heavily Democratic, and I got 48% of the vote. But my 48% of the people that voted for me got no representation. That's the problem with winner take all single member districts. We should let every political persuasion get its proportionate share of representation in legislative bodies, proportionate to their support in the population shown by the vote. And winner take all basically reinforces, it magnifies small majorities into overwhelmingly, you know, like in my district I just described, small majority into 100% control. And that's not democratic. That is basically suppressing political minorities. So proportional representation of all the electoral forms we talk about is probably the big game changer. Because if we have proportional representation in this country, the Greens here would be in state and federal government like they are in Europe, in countries where they do have proportional representation. I mean, people need to understand this country is bizarre, it's rogue, and in that the Green Party is not a major player in the politics of this country, unlike all of Europe, many African and Latin American and Asian countries. So, you know, when people shame us about voting green, you know, they should be ashamed that this country doesn't give proportional representation to all political points of view. And as Ralph Nader says, the people trying to shame us are political bigots. They just want minorities, political minorities, to go away and be excluded, you know, from any power in our government.
In your dreams, do you believe we should demilitarize our police? Yes. One of the things that we have discussed, especially with things coming to the forefront around police aggression and the way that they have been, you know, handling and mishandling communities in this country, is the fact that, you know, I read about the rise of paramilitary policing way back when I was in college in the 90s. This is not a new issue. And when you are giving these sorts of weapons and directives to local police forces, they find reasons to use them. And this is not a place where we need to be. The police, and Howie will probably correct me on this. Police are 5% of what they are responding to are actually things they need to be responding to. The person asleep in a car at a Wendy's is not something you need a police officer, an armed police officer, to respond to. Someone who is having an issue, a mental health crisis, or things like that. Those are things we do not need the police for. And this is what we're asking them, or what they've been asked to do, and they're not equipped to do those things. And so when we're talking about demilitarizing the police, you don't need a tank. Sorry. You don't need a rocket launcher. You don't need some of the things, you know, that some of these police forces have. We don't support police officers having military weapons, you know, stockpiled in their forces. You don't need that.
Yeah, on the statistics, the Vera Institute for Justice looked at FBI statistics and some public opinion polling, and they found a few years ago that only 5% of arrests the police do are for violent crimes like murder, rape, assault, and only another little bit less than 13% is for serious felony property crimes like, you know, carjacking and burglarizing homes. So over 80% of what the cops do is low-level offenses and non-criminal behavior, you know, like traffic stops or, you know, harassing kids on the corner and that kind of stuff. And I think the other statistics they showed is that of the serious crimes, which is what we think the police are out there solving, they only actually clear them with arrests in about 25% of the cases. And the most astounding figure to me is that 60% of victims of violent or serious property crimes do not report them to the police. You want to know why? Because particularly in Black and brown communities, if you were the victim or the witness, you're at the scene of the crime, and people are afraid the police are going to arrest them. They don't trust the police.
Or victimize them.
That happens too. I mean, we got a guy that committed serial rape using his authority as a police officer in Syracuse, New York, and he's retired with his full pension. And he just got a little slap on the wrist. We have drug busts there where they come up in armored troop carriers, like it's Iraq, and they're worried about, you know, improvised explosive devices. And then they jump out in full battle gear like they're the U.S. Army with automatic rifles and scare the hell out of people. But
with their intention.
Yeah, but when we have shootings in the neighborhood, you know, I mentioned this before. I got a bullet hole in the back of my car. There was 20 rounds fired underneath my window, down at some people having a party commemorate somebody had been killed the weekend before. It was like this tit for tat, stupid gang stuff these kids are doing. And 20 rounds shot. I counted the little flags they put when they found the shells. And we have no idea who did that. And no officer knocked on my door to ask me what I saw. All I know is I fell on the ground because it sounded like I was on the firing range back in the Marine Corps. And so people are mad at the police because they get harassed. They're also mad because they don't solve these serious crimes. Demilitarize the police, yeah. And, you know, somebody got to go out and investigate, do the forensics, and apprehend people that are dangerous. That function is needed. But the officers we got don't do it. They do a terrible job of it. That's what those Vera Institute statistics say. Instead, they harass people for low-level offenses and petty crimes, or they're a revenue force, you know. They give tickets for trivial things like, you know, your tail light is out.
Tag man.
Yeah, that's one. Or we have offside parking in Syracuse. They come into the low-income black neighborhood. You can see them. They're like taking a nap until it turns 6 o'clock. Then they go around and give tickets. And it's a revenue source. And that's just, you know, making the community even more angry at the police. And, you know, our broke-ass city needs the revenues, I guess, but people don't have that kind of money. And, of course, once you get in there and you can't pay the fine, then it adds up, and pretty soon you're in bigger trouble just because you didn't move your car in time. I got a ticket at 6:15 the other day, and the only thing is he wrote so lightly, you can't see what my violation was. So I sent that in just saying illegible. But man, oh man, we need the police to protect and serve, and instead they're, you know, abusing and occupying communities that they want to control. Very different situation probably in some affluent communities where officer friendly is who they got to serve and protect them. That's what we all need.
They're actually friendly.
Yeah.
And for people who want to know, the Vera Institute data is now in the chat, so y'all can check that out. And we have received notice that, you know, the boss says it's time to wrap it up.
Well, I don't, what can I say? What you always say, you know, everybody should be safe in this COVID pandemic, which is exploding like wildfire. It has affected our petitioning. For example, in Georgia, it's a hot spot, and we're willing to pay petitioners, but, you know, the professional petitioners that are out there in some states, they didn't want to go to Georgia because that dumb governor down there doesn't think he has to do anything. So Georgia's in serious trouble, as some of these other states are. So be careful out there. We're going to drive through Georgia Friday night, but we ain't stopping and getting too friendly with folks. We're going on to Mississippi or Alabama down in Mobile. So yeah, be safe out there. And you know, we're in a petition drive here. The last 3 petitions are due September 4th. We've qualified for federal primary matching funds. That lasts until August 24th. So any donations up to $250 cumulative from an individual will be matched by Uncle Sam. And that's what's paying for our petition drives at this point. So keep that in mind. You go to howiehawkins.us and hit the donate button. It'll tell you how to make your contribution. And we really appreciate the support people have shown. We're the only campaign in the country that qualified for federal primary matching funds. So that says something. You know, this is a serious campaign. Even if, what was it, ABC News yesterday at the Poor People's Army, they didn't want to interview the presidential candidate who showed up. But you know, we'll just have to find other ways of getting the word out. So
bless our hearts. Well, you know, I'm not going to add too much to that. I need y'all to, you know, eat as well as you possibly can. Guard your energy. Look out for your mental health and those, you know, that of those you love. And y'all stay safe, please.